All right. Well, thank you for the songs and the music and the PowerPoint and everything this evening. Let's go to Colossians chapter number 2. So we are in our study of Bible doctrine that we have been in for a time now. And this is message number 36 in the overall series. And the title of this message is The Law and the Christian. Colossians chapter 2, we will begin our reading in verse 16, going to the end of the chapter. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. Let no man beguile you of your reward in a voluntary humility and worshiping of angels, intruding into those things which he hath not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind, and not holding the head, from which all the body by joints and bands having nourishment ministered and knit together increaseth with the increase of God. Wherefore, if you be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances? Touch not, taste not, handle not, which all are to perish with the using, after the commandments and doctrines of men. Which things have indeed a show of wisdom in will worship and humility, and neglecting of the body, not in any honor to the satisfying of the flesh. So we have studied the subject of salvation for several weeks. And we tend to, when we speak about salvation, we tend to think of salvation in terms of the moment of salvation, the moment of regeneration or conversion, the moment when we become a Christian, so to speak. And depending on when that moment was in a person's life, they could certainly live for many years or even many decades after that time. So, what of the rest of the Christian's mortal life? I mean, how should a Christian live? And we have also emphasized that the works of the law do not contribute to justification in any way. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, "Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." And many will agree with that above statement and then will turn around and try to put Christians under the law for practical righteousness. Or some, at least, are very confused about the place of the law in a Christian's life. Now, the Judaizers in the first century did not deny that the Gentiles could be saved, but they insisted on their living under the law after their conversion. Of course, Paul opposed them and wrote about them in several of his epistles. Many preachers today will preach salvation by grace, but then want to bind men and women under the law for the regulation of their lives. And preachers can fall so easily into guilt-laden legal preaching in an attempt to restrain sin and encourage righteousness in people. Now, in our text, Paul gives the Colossians two ways that men seek to restrain sin and produce righteousness. The first of those ways, as we see there in verses 16 and 17, are by the Old Covenant law. The second of those ways, in verses 18 and 19, and really even down to verse number 22, would be the use of man-made restrictions, man-made rules and regulations to curb sin and to encourage righteousness. And at the end of this chapter, verse number 23, Paul acknowledges that these regulations have an appealing appearance to them, but ultimately concludes they are of no value in actually overcoming sin and walking in life like Christ. And that's what the saying means. It's a little clunky in the grammar there. These things have a show of wisdom, but not in honor, or really that would mean in this context being value to the gratification or the control, you could say, of the flesh. So tonight we want to begin with this passage, and we want to consider, first of all, the failure of legalism, and secondly, the right use of the law. So let's begin with the failure of legalism. Now, legalism as a term is not found in the Bible, and people have all sorts of ways of defining legalism. And if most of us were honest, we would probably think that legalism means living by any stricter standard than what I live by. That's a legalist. That's generally the way we look at it. But more technically, legalism is the belief that works of the law contribute in any way to our salvation. That would be a pretty classical definition of legalism. And based on Paul's writings and based on the teachings of Jesus, particularly in the Gospels in relation to the Pharisees, we really have to expand that definition of legalism to include the imposition of any extra biblical rules on people, even if they are distinguished from works that would merit salvation. So, generally, we would talk about the works of the law not contributing to justification and the works of the law not contributing to sanctification. So, legalism is the binding of men and women under the law or any extra biblical regulations for either justification or sanctification or both of them together. Okay, so one of the problems with legalism is that it always results in cherry picking of the law and the addition of man made rules, things that God never commanded or required. And we can actually see both. When we look in the Gospels, we look at Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees, we can see both of those things a selective partiality when it comes to the law and an adding on of another layer of man made commandments. So, to see that example, Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23, Jesus said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone." Of course, after that, he goes on to say they were straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. In other words, what he's saying of the Pharisees right here is that they're very selective in the laws that they want to emphasize and in the laws that they want to tend to follow, even going beyond, because the law never commanded the tithing of herbs the way that they were practicing. All right, so that would be being selective or partial in what laws are being observed. The second way would be adding of man-made rules, things God never commanded or required, on top of the law. So Mark chapter 7, verses 9 to 13, "And he said unto them, Full well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your own tradition. For Moses said, Honor thy father and thy mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, If a man shall say to his father or mother, It is korban, that is to say, a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, he shall be free. And ye suffer him no more to do aught for his father or his mother, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which ye have delivered, and many such like things do ye." So we see a pretty good definition, biblically speaking, of what legalism really is and what it is about. It is results in a partiality toward the law and the adding of man-made rules and regulations. Now, today, the way that this happens is by men dividing the law arbitrarily and applying it selectively. All right, so many will say, well, the law is divided into three parts: civil, ceremonial, and moral. And that New Covenant Christians are no longer under the civil and ceremonial law, but are under the moral parts of the law. Okay, one problem with this is that the Bible nowhere says that. Nowhere does the Bible ever divide the Old Covenant law into civil, ceremonial, and moral statutes. The Bible never does that. There's not a single biblical author that refers to the law that way. Nor does it ever say that New Covenant Christians are only under 1/3 of the law. Never makes those statements. And once you study the entire law with its 600 plus commands, you realize that actually the law cannot be divided so neatly into those three categories. You can't start parsing out the statutes of the law into one of those three categories. Just take a look sometime at Deuteronomy 22, 1 to 12. And just go through there, and that's just a sample. And see if you can neatly put those laws into moral or civil or ceremonial. And again, there's 600 plus commandments that you have to do that to. And once you really start looking at the commandments of the law, you realize they just can't be so easily. Some things could be, it's true, some things could be, but the whole law cannot be divided that way. Now, that's only one example. There's another problem with this approach. Oh, well, we're not under the civil and ceremonial law, we're just under the moral law. Well, another problem is that the Bible explicitly denies that that can be done. So James chapter 2, verse 10 says, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point is guilty of all." Galatians chapter 3, verse 10, "For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, Cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them." You either have to keep the law in total or not at all. You cannot keep it partially and decide which ones you'll keep, which ones you won't keep, and so on. So these are obviously problems with this approach. Now, when we look here in Colossians chapter 2, it's obvious that Paul is referring to Old Covenant law. He says in verse 16, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body or the substance is of Christ." So when he says to let no one judge you, that word typically means condemn. He's saying don't let anyone judge you or condemn you for your failure to keep these things, these new moons and holy days and so on. He refers to them as a shadow, which is exactly what the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 10 and verse 1. "For the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect." In other words, the writer of Hebrews explicitly says that these observances of the law are a shadow of the things that are to come. And of course, Jesus Christ is the substance or the fulfillment. That's exactly what Paul says here about it. So Paul refers to laws pertaining to clean and unclean foods. He refers to laws pertaining to festivals and to Sabbaths. And he says, let no man condemn you in these things. In other words, let no one constrain you, bring you under constraint to have to observe these things according to Old Covenant law. So let's just take Sabbaths as an example, because there are many today who claim to observe and teach the observance of a so-called Christian Sabbath. So on Sundays, many that I've known, they don't buy anything on a Sunday. They don't travel anywhere other than to church. They don't participate in any sort of secular activity or entertainment or whatever, and they condemn those who do. Now, the Bible never commands a Christian Sabbath, nor does the Bible ever give rules for the observance of such a Christian Sabbath. It's just not there. This so-called Christian Sabbath is nothing more than a man-made regulation that is obviously man-made when we look to the law and we see what it actually says about Sabbaths, plural, because there are more than one. So what does the Old Testament say about the Sabbath? I'm going to give a bunch of references. I'm not going to read all of these for sake of time, but I'm going to give you a bunch of references to show you where these are coming from. Well, obviously, the reason for the Sabbath is primarily that it was for rest, and we can see that in the Old and the New Testament as well. One reason for the Sabbath was for feasting, Leviticus chapter 23, verses 1 to 3. One reason for the Sabbath was to reflect on the works of God and the creation pattern. We see that in the book of Exodus. It is a memorial of redemption, Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 15. It is for liberation. Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 10, the time when indebted servitude was limited to 6 years. The seventh would be a Sabbath, and those things were to all be released in that time. And obviously, the Sabbath, according to Hebrews chapter 4 in particular, is a sign of the future and final rest in Christ. So that Sabbath that was instituted. Okay, so the emphasis of the Old Testament Sabbath was not worship, actually. The emphasis of the Old Testament Sabbath was rest. And it was man resting in acknowledgement of God who works. In other words, it was an exercise of faith that we can work 6 days and we can rest one day because we are dependent on Yahweh to care for us. So, what were some of the requirements of the Sabbath? And there were a number of them. These are things that were considered unlawful on the Sabbath. There was no work to be done. And of course, rabbis for generation have been debating about what constitutes work and what does not, and a whole number of silly things have come out of that. But Exodus chapter 34, verse 21, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 to 15. On the Sabbath, they were required to stay home. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 29. A Sabbath day's journey was originally measured from the farthest reaches of the camp to the center of the camp where the tabernacle was located. Of course, by the time of Jesus, the time of the Pharisees in the first century, they had greatly amended the Sabbath day's journey and that whole concept. There were no fires to be kindled on the Sabbath day, Exodus chapter 35 and verse 3. There was to be no gathering of sticks for a fire, Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 35. There was to be no food or any sort of goods that were bought, Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 31. Donkeys were not to be loaded, Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 15. No food or wares to be sold, Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 15. No sheaves gathered, same verse. No wine treading in the press, same verse. The gates of the city were supposed to be shut, Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 19. And there were no burdens to be borne, according to Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 to 22. All right, so this is primarily things that were unlawful on the Sabbath day. Things that were lawful on the Sabbath day, however, was obviously the priest's service. So Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 to 10, Matthew chapter 12, verse 5. And in fact, Jesus spoke of how the priests profaned the Sabbath because it was not a day of rest for the priest and those involved in the tabernacle service. It was a day of labor. Life could be saved on the Sabbath, and Jesus said this on Mark chapter 3 and verse 4. The sick could be healed on the Sabbath, Matthew chapter 12, verses 10 to 13. Animals could be rescued on the Sabbath, Matthew chapter 12, verse 11. The hungry could be fed on the Sabbath, Luke chapter 6, verses 1 to 5. And animals watered, according to Luke chapter 13 and verse 15. So the Sabbath was given, and the Sabbath was given for men, it was given for servants, it was given for animals, and it was given for the land. All of these mention Leviticus chapter 25, verses 1 to 7, and verses 20 to 22. All right, so that's just sort of a general outline and overview of the Sabbath as it was given in the Old Covenant law. But this is actually not all. So when someone says that we are observing or should be observing the Sabbath today, the question that we should really ask in response is which one? Which Sabbath should we be observing? It is not enforced, first of all, in the New Testament, obviously. We see that here as Paul is plainly saying, let no one condemn you in these Sabbaths. But the Old Testament Sabbath was not only a Saturday Sabbath. That was one of the Sabbaths that was commanded in the Old Covenant law. The month Abib was the first month of the Jewish calendar, and the 15th of Abib, sometimes called Nisan, was a fixed Sabbath. In other words, you had a 30-day month and you had a 7-day week. So that means that the fixed dates fell on different days of the week. So the 15th of Nisan, which came before or around the time of the Passover, after the Passover, was a fixed Sabbath. It occurred on the 15th of the month. Whether that was a Sunday through Saturday didn't matter. Now, if it fell on a Saturday, then it was on the day of a weekly Sabbath. But it was fixed. It was called a high Sabbath. Only once in 7 years, then, would that actually fall on a Saturday. But that also there was a fixed cycle until Pentecost. So that meant that the 1st and the 8th of the month Abib were Sabbaths. And for 7 weeks following, that would be Abib 22nd, Abib 29th, Igar 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th, and Sivan 4, until the 50th day, which was Pentecost. And this is Leviticus chapter 23, verses 6 to 7, verse 11, verses 15 to 16. In other words, there's a whole lot of Sabbaths there beyond just a weekly Saturday Sabbath. If you count 7 weeks, that's 49 days. 7 weeks of 7 days is 49 days and not 50. Well, the 50th day from Abib the 15th was Pentecost, and it was also a Sabbath. So, Sivan 4 and 5 were a 2-day or a 48-hour Sabbath every year. Leviticus chapter 23, verses 15 to 16 and verse 21. Also, the month Abib, the 10th, the 14th, and the 16th were fixed days of work when a Sabbath could not be observed. So on those days, if they fell on a Saturday, they were fixed days of specified work, and a regular Sabbath could not be observed. That's Exodus chapter 12, verse 3, verses 5 to 6, verse 24, Leviticus chapter 23, and verse 15. The Old Testament Sabbath was also not always one day. Pentecost is obviously be one of those examples. There was a year Sabbath, according to Leviticus chapter 25, verses 4 and 8. There was a 2-year Sabbath in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 8 to 12. There was a 70-year Sabbath spoken of in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse number 21. There were many, many Sabbaths according to the Old Covenant law. And not all of them had the same requirements. Some of them did, some of them did not. So the weekly Sabbath required 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. On the new moon Sabbath, labor was not forbidden and sacrifice was required. Numbers chapter 28, verses 11 to 15. The Feast of Trumpets, or the New Year, was also a Sabbath. The year of Jubilee was a sabbatical year. Exodus chapter 23, verse 10, Leviticus chapter 25, verses 1 to 10, Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 to 11, Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 10 to 13. And debts could only be contracted for 6 years, and the 7th year was that year of release, that Sabbath year. Obviously, around the Passover, there were more Sabbaths, and they had certain requirements. The high day being the preparation day, Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 28. The Feast of Unleavened Bread lasted for 7 days, and each one of those days was a Sabbath day, Exodus chapter 13 and verse 16. The Feast of Weeks was 7 weeks after Passover, was a harvest thanksgiving on Nisan 16th. The Feast of Tabernacles was kept for 7 days by dwelling in booths, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 36 and 42. The penalty, of course, for breaking the Sabbath day was death. Exodus chapter 31, verses 14 to 15, Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. So this highlights the fact of the importance and enduring principle to the Sabbath. So if you come back to this simple basic statement of the Sabbath, that weekly Sabbath was a cycle of work and rest that was to be followed after the creation pattern. So if someone is supposedly observing the Sabbath today, then the first question we should ask is which one? And if they're not observing them all, why not? Why do you get to pick one Sabbath that you're going to observe? I know of a church several years ago in Kentucky that actually changed their Sunday services to Saturday in order to be more biblical in their observance of the Christian Sabbath. Of course, are they doing all of these things that we've talked about in the law? No, they're not. It is a selective, partial, cherry-picking, choosing and picking observance of the law with extra layer of man-made traditions on top of it. Now, Paul stated here in Colossians chapter 2, in verse number 23, that the law, along with these commandments and doctrines of men, are of no value in subduing the flesh. So these are things that we naturally resort to in an attempt to restrain sin and promote righteousness in our lives and in our midst. But Paul says that for those very purposes, those things are of no value. They do not work, you could say. So, what is the right use of the law for a Christian? And this relationship that a Christian today has to the law, oftentimes, again, very confused or very foggy what sort of relationship this is. Well, first of all, believers in Jesus Christ have been united with him through faith and are not under the law. Romans chapter 7, verses 1 to 6, Paul put it this way: Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she's free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sin which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. So simply put, again, you believe in Jesus Christ, then you have been united with him, and you have died to the law. It is not over you. It is not binding upon you any longer. Paul goes on in Romans 7 to show that that doesn't make the law sinful. It doesn't make the law bad, or that the law is of no use. Like we could just tear it out of our Bibles and throw it away. Obviously, that's not the case. The law was not given to justify, nor was it given to sanctify. And Paul's very plain in Romans 7 and 8, when you look in those chapters, that the law can't do either one of those things. It is weak through the flesh. But what is the real purpose of the law? Well, Paul speaks to this in Romans chapter 3, beginning at verse 19. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ unto all, and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. So Paul says, first of all, that the law gives the knowledge of sin. This is one of the purposes of the law, to give the knowledge of sin. So the law does show us our sin. The law does show us how far short of God's righteousness that we really fall. The law also gives condemnation, but it does not provide justification. When Paul preached there in Antioch and Pisidia at the synagogue, he said that by believing in Jesus Christ, you're justified from all the things that you could never be justified from by the law of Moses or the Old Covenant law. So the law gives a knowledge of sin. The law gives condemnation. Paul said right there that all of the world is guilty. All mouths are stopped. Look at the law. Everyone is guilty and deserving of death. Secondly, Paul also said that the righteousness of God apart from the law is witnessed by the law. Did you catch that? Right there in verse 21. But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God which is by faith of Jesus Christ. So Paul says one of the purposes of the law is to witness to the righteousness of God apart from the law. In other words, the law was given to show us our need of Jesus Christ and his righteousness, but it could not get us there. The law shows us that. It has a shadow of those things that are to come, but the law, Paul compared it to the schoolmaster, or even almost to like a guardian or something that we're imprisoned under until faith comes. See, the law shows us the righteousness of God that is by faith, but it can't get us there. Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning in verse 8, "But we know that the law is good if a man use it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, for men stealers, for liars, for perjured persons, and if there be any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust." So the law is good when it is used lawfully. So we must use the law lawfully as Christians today. That means that we should read and study from the law. There is much to be learned from the law. I could take a poll and say, how many of you realized until we went through that there was actually more than one Sabbath in the law? I'll be honest with you, I did not for a very long time know that. So there is profit and benefit, much to learn in studying the law, but using it lawfully means understanding what Paul said there. It is made for sinners. It is made for the condemned and the guilty. And as redeemed, justified believers in Jesus Christ, we are not under it. We do learn from it. We learn about the holiness of God. We learn about sin. We learn about real righteousness. We learn about the sacrifice of Jesus Christ in our place, but we are not under it as though we are bound by the old covenant law. Now, admittedly, a message like this that declares plainly that Christians today are not under the law is usually met with a response that by saying such, I'm suggesting it's perfectly okay for Christians to lie and steal and murder and commit adultery. And it's one of those kind of things. I wish I had $1 for every time. Happens regularly. Now, obviously, this is a large subject, and this is just a single message, and we're just scratching the surface of a lot of these issues. But rather than giving a lengthy answer to that, let me just ask a couple of questions. Was Abel righteous and was Cain evil? Well, the correct answer to both of those questions is yes. Abel was righteous and Cain was evil. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4 says, "By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh." 1 John chapter 3 and verse 12, "Not as Cain, who was of that wicked one," which is a reference to the devil, "and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil, and his brother's righteous." But how could that be, since both of these men lived so long before the old covenant law was ever given? Seems like it wasn't perfectly okay to lie and to murder your brother, even though the old covenant law had never been given. Why would we think that it would be okay to do such things today just because we're not under or bound by the old covenant law? Well, there is two short answers to this. First of all, the law, it is an expression of sin, but it's not the only expression of sin. And secondly, God's holiness is eternal, as God is eternal, and is not confined merely to the old covenant. So Christians today learn from the law. We understand sin and righteousness better through the law. We understand the depth of condemnation that we were in through the law. I mean, if you really begin to think yourself a pretty good person, then a thorough study of the law should disabuse you of that notion. We also should see Christ in the law. Just as Paul said, he is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So if we look at the law of God and don't see Christ, we're missing it all. We should see Christ in the law so that we esteem him more highly, love him more deeply through the law. Obviously, these are things that we many times neglect. As I said, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of trying to wrestle with these things and put the law together. And really, one of the reasons I believe for that is that we are just simply not preaching and studying books like Galatians and Hebrews enough. We're not studying those books enough. Those things tell us about many of these issues in a far greater detail than what I have gone into tonight. Hopefully this will be help and a blessing. That's all of our message for this evening. We will close with a hymn.